name is Sarah Stern. I'm the founder and president of the Endowment for Middle East Truth, or RMET, and it is our profound pleasure and honor to introduce you to David Goldman today. And now that there are a myriad of challenges coming out of Turkey, out of Iran, out of North Korea, it is a profound pleasure and honor to be able to introduce you to David Goldman.
Sarah, thank you for those very kind words. It's my honor entirely. The world has changed dramatically in the past year, mainly because of the ascendancy of China and to a lesser extent because of the ascendancy of Russia in Eurasia. This changes what we can do about Iran, it changes Turkey, and it may change Egypt. And it's made the world a great deal more difficult. For example, I'm looking at an article by one James Dorsey, who's teaching at the main Strategic Studies School in Singapore, in a publication called The Globalist. And Dorsey attacks President Trump for threatening to rewire the Iran nuclear deal under the headline, How Trump's Iran Move Plays into China's Hands. He says there's another dimension that Mr. Trump overlooks completely. His choice on the Iran deal could tilt European-Chinese competition for domination of Eurasia's future energy infrastructure decisively in China's favor. That is a bewildering choice for a president who is presumably so interested in reigning in China. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there sadly is a degree of truth to that. Turkey has made clear that it's no longer interested in membership in the European Union, and its diplomatic spats with the Germans in particular have been so bitter during the last several months that it really probably has burned that bridge. And that is a revolutionary change for a country whose exports and tourism and foreign investment overwhelmingly were Eurocentric for the past 20 years, which still has an enormous Turkish diaspora in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, and whose main ambition was to become a member of the European Union. What has happened is that China is the magnet now for Turkish economic ambitions, and Turkey is looking east instead of west. Among other manifestations of this change in Turkish policy was the extraordinary fact last month that Turkey purchased an air defense system from Russia, the formidable S-400 air defense system, which has a 400-kilometer range, and in fact is probably better than anything the United States is putting on the market. For a NATO member to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in a high-tech product from Russia is effectively giving up NATO membership. So Turkey has become, as far as the United States is concerned, a rogue state. Right now, Washington appears to be running around in tight little circles trying to figure out what to do about these things. So the first thing Washington has done is to try to placate different constituencies. The Pentagon has a big investment in Turkey, of course, which is a NATO member. So the Pentagon tends to want to placate the Erdogan government. For that reason, the United States has been publicly hostile to the Kurdish independence referendum, which just took place yesterday, and has allied itself with Turkey in telling the Kurds to take their national aspirations off the table, considering that the Kurds are the only people in the region who have governed themselves successfully, created something resembling a democracy in their autonomous zone in northern Iraq, and most of all have fought effectively and heroically for American interests in suppressing ISIS. I would characterize Washington's stance towards the Turks as repugnant and hypocritical and disgusting. It might be that the road to Kurdish nationhood might be long and tortuous, but the very least the United States could do would be to acknowledge their national aspirations, but we're not doing any such thing. We are aligning with the Turks because we're terrified that they're leaving NATO. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we have to lose, and what could we do to frighten the Turks into looking towards NATO again? The Iranians have a great deal more flexibility in negotiating with the United States than they did only a year or two ago. There are now two major rail lines that have been constructed going from China to Iran. They've cut the transport time from, say, the Chinese coast to Iran in half. They've reduced its cost, and that will go a long way to hardwiring the Iranian economy into China. Next month, a major rail line will open that will go through Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Georgia and Turkey, which will cut the cut the freight time from China to the Mediterranean by half as well. All of this is part of a great Chinese ambition, which the Chinese call One Belt, One Road, and they've committed $1 trillion to building infrastructure, which would make them the dominant force in the Eurasian sphere, not just in transportation, but in technology, particularly in mobile broadband. And the attraction of this infrastructure spending is enormous. Something like $50 billion are being spent in Pakistan to open the Kandahar port in Pakistan to Chinese trade, to pipelines and so forth, so China can presumably bypass the Straits of Malacca and secure its energy supplies. To the extent that the United States puts economic pressure on Iran, the Chinese have the ability to compensate for a great deal of that. Of course, China has been doing that all along. China was Iran's major trading partner all through the years of the Iranian boycott when it was effective. But now the Chinese are prepared to do a great deal more, and the world is responding to them. If you look at the North Korea situation, this is not unrelated. Many writers, including my close friend Michael Ledeen, have recently called attention to the relationship between the North Korean and Iranian missile and nuclear weapons programs. They're linked to each other. They help each other. They do testing for each other. Where does China fit into all of this? Well, I am not sure that China is particularly pleased about either North Korea or Iran becoming significant nuclear powers. Nonetheless, China is prepared to use the instability created by both these nuclear programs to increase its leverage on the world stage, and particularly its leverage with the United States. It seems clear that the Trump administration has come to the conclusion that we need China to deal with North Korea. That limits our ability to put pressure on the Chinese in other spheres. In other words, if China is voting with us at the United Nations to impose sanctions on North Korea and using its own trading capacity to squeeze the North Korean regime, do we really want to antagonize China over other issues? So China's ascendancy over the North Korea matter in East Asia enhances its ability to play economic and strategic cards in Eurasia. How does Washington view this matter? Well, I think there's a lot of debate about it, but it's certainly the case. The one thing I can say as a matter of surface observation is that the China hawks are clearly on the outs, and the China doves are clearly on the in. Steve Bannon was the most prominent China hawk. He, of course, has been fired. General McMaster's, whom I do not know personally and about whose views I do not wish to comment. One thing I could say about McMaster's is that he assigned to every senior staffer at the National Security Council a book that was published earlier this year by a Harvard professor. The book is called The Thucydides Trap. And the upshot of the Thucydides Trap is that China is ascendant as a world power, and we have to accommodate them, or we will get into a war that we don't want. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a defeatist manifesto, but it certainly is pessimistic about our ability to contain China's influence, and very clear in its conclusion that we have to accommodate this. From the standpoint of Turkey, now a couple of years ago, Turkey looked like it was going into an economic tailspin. In fact, it was. Turkey's economy had experienced zero growth. The Turkish stock market was at multi-year low. Then at the beginning of this year, something began to change. Until the end of August, Turkey was the best performing stock market of all the world's major stock markets. Market was up 50% in dollar terms. Since then, with the Kurdish crisis, it's pulled back by about 10%, but still an incredible snapback. Turkey's growing economically again, 5-6% a year. A great deal. I mean, Turkey has very high inflation, very high interest rates, so it's dependent on a lot of hot money. It's an unstable situation. But what really appears to be happening is that the impact of Chinese direct investment and infrastructure building in Turkey is beginning to create a lot of confidence in the Turkish economy. And this China relationship may be the key towards Turkey turning around. And it has other implications. One of the interesting things about the Turkish economy is next to China, of all the world's developing economies, Turkey has the highest rate of smartphone penetration. If I recall the numbers, more than 70% of Turks have a smartphone. China has become the world's first truly cashless society among major emerging markets. That means no more tax evasion, harder to make bribes because the authorities can track every single transaction coming from smartphones. Jack Ma and Alibaba and e-commerce have become are joined at the hip to the ambitions of the Communist Party, and they look at this as the future of modernization. The Turks have stated they want to modernize their own economy on the Chinese model. Chinese phone companies have been buying into Turkish mobile phone companies. Turkey wants to be cashless 5 or 6 years from now, and they're bringing in the Chinese to help them do it. For an emerging economy, this is an incredible change. Emerging economies generally have 30 or 40% of economic activity off the books. That's the case for Turkey as well. Vast numbers of people, a third of the population, spends their life in extremely low productivity activity, small retail businesses, small service businesses, no access to capital, hard to find customers. And suddenly, the revolution in mobile broadband that's being financed by this $1 trillion Chinese One Belt, One Road project will reach down into the grassroots of emerging economies from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea and mobilize human resources on a scale that we've never seen before. So Turkey has a reason to look to China. 2-3 years ago, the majority opinion on Wall Street is China would collapse of its own weight. Dictatorships can't function economically. It's a sclerotic system. They can't innovate. They just steal. They'll dig their own grave. The contempt that the West typically had for China 2 or 3 years ago has now turned into panic at how well they're doing. I don't think there's an example of such a turnaround in Western opinion of an Asian country since General Percival surrendered the British garrison to the Japanese at Singapore in 1942. So what I think we can say fairly is that we can exercise a good deal of leverage on Turkey. We can exercise a good deal of leverage on Iran. It's not yet the case that Iran could do without access to Western banking, for example. It's simply not true that Turkey could do without the good graces of NATO. If we really wanted to make the Turks unhappy, we could alert them to the fact that shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles sometimes fall off the backs of trucks. And if the Kurds happen to pick up a few of them, they shouldn't go around blaming us. These things just happen. There are a lot of things we could do if we wanted to be rough with the Turks and the Iranians. Nonetheless, in the medium term, as the economic weight shifts towards China and this Eurasian expansion reorients the Turkish and Iranian economies, our influence will ebb over time. And unless we find a way to reassert American technological supremacy with respect to China, China will continue to gain on us. The book that I mentioned that General McMaster's gave to every senior staffer at the National Security Council, Graham Allison's book, The Acidities Trap, is in many ways a flawed book. I have a review of it coming out very soon in the Claremont Review of Books. And I hate to increase the book circulation, but Professor Allison does give us a pretty good idea of how effective parts of the Chinese economy are. I'll leave you with one number. 1 out of every 3 Chinese college students chooses engineering as a major. In the United States, it's 1 out of 14, and if we took out the Asian foreign students, it would be 1 out of 20. China's graduating 4 times as many undergraduate STEM degrees as we are, twice as many STEM PhDs, and a great many of the PhDs that we're granting in the United States are going to Chinese who go back to China. So America's economic and technological prowess are being challenged in a way that they really haven't been challenged since perhaps Sputnik. And there seems to be no reaction to it except a resigned view from people like Professor Allison saying, well, what can we do? China's ascended, and we simply have to accommodate that. If we do so, our influence on the Eurasian continent will erode over time, and this will pose considerable difficulties for the state of Israel for obvious reasons. The Chinese are neither hostile to Israel nor friendly to Israel. They have no friends and no enemies. The Chinese look at the whole world and think protein source. They're purely pragmatic and utterly without principle and quite cruel when they have to be. They like order. I don't think this necessarily means a war between us and China. Chinese don't want to colonize other places. They're not good at it. They never have in their entire history. But a world where China is the dominant power would be one in which we'd be considerably poor, and a lot of bad things would happen. So I hate to be so pessimistic, but from what I can see in the U.S. administration, the view is spreading that China's influence in Eurasia is making it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to throw our weight around as we could in the past. It's certainly convincing countries like Turkey and Iran that Their economic future is not with the West, but with the East. And sadly, I do not see in the U.S. administration anything resembling a strategic response. The only response that I see is a sense of resignation and accommodation. So the world has changed a great deal in the past year. It's likely that the path of least resistance would indicate a great deal more change in the next several years, but this change is not going to be to the advantage of the United States of America. So that's a summary of what I see out there. I'd be glad to take some questions.
As a matter of fact, more people have joined the call, and many people are listening, and this was extremely enlightening, if not frightening. As the moderator, I would like to take the liberty of the first question. So it seems as though we have developed a pattern in the United States of acquiescing to power. And I'm wondering, A, if you had the ear of the President of the administration right now, what would you do to wake them up, to make them respond that it's not in our best interest to just acquiesce, to people that do not have our interests at heart? And B, while we still have time, what would you do to try to rein in Iran and Turkey's behavior?
Well, the first thing I would do is make clear that our sympathies lie with the Kurds. That the United States recognizes and in principle supports Kurdish national aspirations, although we would argue that such aspirations should be pursued in an appropriate framework of international law, which would mean getting an international commission to hold plebiscites and so forth over a period of time. That would make the Turks extremely upset. Turks have threatened to invade Iraqi Kurdistan, in retaliation for independence moves. We should make clear to the Turks that if they do so, there will be really terrible consequences. For example, we could make it difficult for foreign investors to put money in Turkish banks. We could crash the currency overnight. A lot of things we could do if we want to be rough to the Turks. And in the meantime, we should filter a few sophisticated weapons like man-pads, in other words, man-portable air defense missiles and sophisticated anti-tank weapons into the Kurds to make it very difficult for the Turks to conduct any incursions. At the same time, I believe that the way to deal with the Iranians is pretty much the way my friend Michael Ledeen suggested. Iran is one of the least functional societies in the world right now. This is something I've written about a great deal over the past. But Iran is going to be the first country that gets old before it gets rich. The people who are adults who are of childbearing age in Iran today come from families of 7 children on average, but they're having 1 to 2 children. Iran has the highest rate of infertility among couples in the world, which is close to 25%. It's unknown anywhere else in the world. There are some observers who think this is because Iran has, by an order of magnitude, by a factor of 10, the highest rate of venereal disease infection in the world, particularly chlamydia. This is a society of miserable people groaning under a horrible theocratic regime with many minorities who hate the Persian overlords, including the Iranian Curve. So I think that the the best way to address Iran right now is to put external as well as internal pressure on them. Revive the boycott. If the Chinese want to go and subsidize them, that's their problem. We can argue with them about it, but I believe that American resources dedicated towards helping Iranian both political and ethnic opposition would go a long way towards neutralizing the ambitions of the Tehran regime. So there are a lot of things we can do. We simply have to be willing to play dirty. One thing we're not going to do is deploy a lot of American troops. The United States absolutely lost appetite for that. Michael Duran at the Hudson Institute had a long paper in Mosaic magazine last month in which he argued that the right thing for the United States to do is to keep a troop presence, particularly in eastern Syria, to break up the possibility that the Iranians might create this Shiite corridor going from Iran all the way to the Lebanon and then to the Mediterranean. I'm not really sure we're in position to do that. I don't know that the body politic would accept a significant American troop presence. So the question is, what else can we do to disrupt it? And the answer probably is the closest allies we have are the Kurds. But we've just thrown the Kurds under the bus. So in order to keep the appearance of stability in our relations with Turkey, we've closed off what probably is our best option for dealing with Iran. Turkey and Iran are working together behind our back. This has been widely discussed in the media. There's no secret about it. They have an urgent interest in working together against the Kurds because they both have Kurdish minorities who would like their freedom against, respectively, the dictatorships in Ankara and Tehran. So that's why you have joint exercises, which were announced in the press this morning, between Turkish and Iraqi troops on the border of the Kurdish Autonomous Zone in Iraq. The Iraqi army, of course, is basically Shiite militias run by Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers. So we know what that is. There are plenty of things we could do, but it would mean that we would have to we'd have to play really dirty. And I don't see anyone in Washington with the stomach for it. Well, Egypt is still struggling. They've been living since General Sisi throughout the Muslim Brotherhood government. They've been living on infusions of cash from the Gulf states and then several months ago from the International Monetary Fund. But in return for a $12 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund, which sort of gets them through this year, they were forced to devalue their currency by a huge margin, and that's put inflation up to roughly 30%. It's also created a shortage of critical items. So, for example, there are about 1,400 basic medicines which are in short supply in Egypt. Egypt is living economically mainly off the remittances of the millions of Egyptian workers in the Persian Gulf and Europe. It's really the Egyptian diaspora, Egyptians earning hard currency working overseas, supporting their families, which is keeping the Egyptian economy going, but with its nose barely above water. So this is clearly a difficult and volatile situation. How is this likely to evolve? Well, Egypt desperately needs infrastructure investment to make its economy viable, create export industries. And again, the only country which is promising substantial amounts of investment for infrastructure is China. China is building a second Suez Canal. It's building a railroad parallel to the Suez Canal. China has agreed to help build a new capital for Egypt, very prominent in the Egyptian economy, and that creates a dilemma for the United States. In my view, as much as I want to compete toe-to-toe with China, I think that Egypt would be one case where it would be to our advantage to collaborate with China. But I don't see Egypt as being a major factor in Western Asia. In other words, the Egyptian army is not going to run off to get involved in wars in Syria. They're simply out of the question. The Egyptians have no interest in getting involved. Otherwise, Egyptian-Israeli relations are very good. Politically and strategically, Egypt is the least of our problems because General Sisi wants to maintain good relations with his neighbors, particularly Israel. But the economic situation is touch and go. Egypt's stability is a significant concern, and again, sadly, it really appears that the Chinese are the most proactive in addressing Egypt's long-term economic problems, not the West. Now, I'm an American, not an Israeli, and I'm very cautious about kibitzing in internal Israeli politics. I will support any Israeli government that the Israeli people elect. I may be critical of its policies, but I tend to avoid making detailed recommendations. It is the case that less than 10 years ago, the male labor force participation rate of Israeli Haredis was at about a third, and it's now up to about 50%. So clearly, whatever policies have been adopted, they are having reasonably good effect. I mean, clearly, since the Haredi are the fastest growing portion of the Israeli population, a low labor force participation rate is an impossible situation to sustain. The one thing I'll say as an observant Jew is that the idea that every male child should be a Torah scholar is a very bad idea, because the main thing you get out of that is very bad Torah. Not everybody is supposed to be a Talmid Chacham. Most people are supposed to make a living, and then we subsidize the few really talented kids who are particularly good at this. So I certainly hope things continue to move in that direction. As I'm sure everyone is aware, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled just a week or two ago that Haredi men had to enter the army, that it was a violation of equal responsibility for them to receive objections, and this, of course, created consternation in the coalition and some street demonstrations. I simply am not in position to advise the Israeli government as to how to deal with an intractable and difficult problem, which they've been addressing for years and has made some progress. So I'm not going to give detailed recommendations to the Israelis. I'm simply encouraged that some progress has been made, and I hope more is made. Well, Turkey, the main problem with Turkey is there aren't a lot of Turks in Turkey. At a clear horizon, Turkey does not exist in its present form. The main reason is the Kurds, who are now between 20 and 25% of the population, have twice as many children as ethnic Turks. This is a tendency that's been observable for some time. the 2015 Turkish census, which I wrote about in Asia Times, showed an acceleration of this trend. So by the middle of the 2040s, the absolute majority of Turkish citizens under the age of 30 will come from households where Kurdish is the first language. In other words, most of the military-age men will be Kurds, people who identify as ethnic Kurds. I was involved in a study for the Pentagon with a couple of demographers, which crunched the numbers on this. So, from Turkey's standpoint, the country has to change radically. It will begin aging very rapidly, except for the Kurds. So, what's the economic future? Turkey, I think, is going to end up being the western terminus of this Chinese new Silk Road. There are plenty of Turks in the world, but they aren't in Turkey. You have about 110, 120 million Turks in the various Central Asian republics, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. The Turks already recruit labor from the republics for their construction operations overseas, particularly in Russia. Turks are the main construction workers in Russia, which has its own demographic problems. So what I think will probably happen is that Turkey will absorb immigrants, particularly Turkic-speaking immigrants from Central Asia. The Turkish economy will become hardwired, I mean literally by mobile broadband and long-distance rail, into the Chinese economy, and it will be a Chinese economic satrapy. Well, Saudi funding of jihad doesn't come off the official budget. Saudi Arabia has a unique government in that it's not really a government, it's not a republic, it's a family. I mean, suppose the United States were called the Rockefeller States of America, or England were called the Maxwell States of America, or Italy were called the Agnelli State of Italy. It's a family enterprise. So there are several thousand members of the royal family with vast amounts of money, and they support their own jihadi causes, whatever the ministers of the Saudi government happen to think. This is a major complaint on the part of other countries dealing with the Saudis. The Saudi government may give them assurances, but they still finance all the madrasas. The Chinese were particularly cross with the Saudis because in Western China, where you have this Turkic Muslim minority in Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, all the Uyghur madrasas are being financed by members of the Saudi royal family through informal finance networks. The Saudi government would say, well, we don't have anything to do with that. But of course, it was Uncle Abdullah who was sending money across the mountains on a donkey or whatever to fund the madrasas. Saudi Arabia is a rich country full of poor people. The last time I looked at this, more than a third of the country was under the poverty line, and they live on government subsidies. So the political stability of the country is threatened by oil prices below $50 a barrel. If oil continues to hold for Brent crude above 60, they're in considerably better shape. But as far as I know, they will go ahead and raise money through Aramco, and I don't think that oil money has any significant impact on their funding for jihad. The main thing that affects their willingness to fund jihad is the number of one-way trips to the empty quarter arranged by the Saudi security services for members of the royal family who can't keep their wallets in their pockets.
I'd like to take the liberty of asking you two more questions. It's Sarah again. Number one, in 2009, under President Obama, I think we missed a tremendous opportunity for a velvet revolution when the people out in the streets throughout Iran, millions of them, were protesting the mullahs, and people's skulls were bashed in, and they were arrested and carted off to Evin prison, never to be seen or heard from again. If somehow we were able to convince the administration, do you think that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or do you think we could have some of our agents on the ground in Tehran to work with and Iran, throughout Iran, to work with the underground and help, a people's revolution? Because, as you said, most of the people really resent the mullahs, and most of them were not even around in 1979 during the Khomeini revolution.
Oh,
and the second question has to do with Egypt. We have a wonderful relationship now with Sisi, but I know the Muslim Brotherhood might be down but never out. How long do you think it's going to be before this relationship becomes shaky once again?
My field is not covert operations. I do not know the chances of success of a covert operation to destabilize the Iranian government. However, I think that whatever the likelihood of success is, the costs of attempting it are not that great. So I would be very enthusiastic about the administration doing so, and I proposed in print that they engage someone like my friend Michael Ledeen to direct such a project. Michael is a strong advocate of helping Iranian opposition overthrow the regime, and I would love to see him and people like that given their opportunity. Iran, certainly, to the extent that objective social and economic conditions are a gauge of political stability, Iran is at the bottom of the scale. It should be ripe for destabilization in principle, but again, it's not my field. I can't give a professional answer about that. Regarding Egypt, I think there's a great deal to worry about because the Egyptian economy simply is not viable as it stands now. It's a money-losing enterprise, so to speak. In 2016, the current account deficit, basically a trade deficit, reached about 6% of GDP, which is the highest it had been in many years. That was simply unsustainable, so the International Monetary Fund asked them to devalue the currency so people would have less purchasing power for foreign goods, and the deficit has come down, but at the expense of great hardship. As I mentioned, Egypt found itself short of essential medicines. That's not a good situation. So the possibility that Egypt might undergo more political instability is mitigated only by the fact that the experience that the Egyptian people had of actually being ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood was so horrible that they're not likely to try it again soon. Nonetheless, it's a gravely concerning situation, and I think that if the United States were to take it seriously, we would want to get together with the Europeans and the Chinese and really have a crash program to build Egyptian infrastructure, great jobs, and stabilize that economy. Right now, all that's happening is the Gulf states were writing big checks, and the International Monetary Fund were writing big checks, but nothing really has improved on the ground. I would have very mixed feelings about the Chinese taking the lead in stabilizing Egypt. That would probably be a good thing, but I hate the Chinese gaining the influence. Last I checked, the Israeli total fertility rate is now higher than the Arab total fertility rate for the first time since 1948. This is a pattern we see everywhere where literacy comes to Muslim countries. Fertility drops drastically. Women choose to marry late, not marry at all, and to have fewer children. So both Israelis and Arabs are having roughly 3 children per female. with the Israelis slightly ahead. There's no reason to expect this to change. The Haredi contribution to this, is, of course, is disproportionate, but the so-called Israeli secular fertility rate is close to 2.5 children per family. So there is no reason to expect any significant change in demographic proportions between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean anytime in the next 50 years. So the idea that a tiny number of Israelis are going to be ruling an increasing number of Arabs is simply not justified by any data of any kind at all. The idea of a population bomb threatening the security of the Jewish state was an important influence on the Oslo process from the beginning, back in the 90s. It was probably the single worst forecast that was made by any government in the history of diplomacy. It was just completely wrong. Things went in the opposite direction. And now you have critics of Israel saying Israel's problem is they're going to have too many people. It'll get too crowded. What will we do with all of these? I don't know. Maybe we'll have to go rent Lemberg again from the Poles as their population declines. We'll figure it out.